So this is part two of a session on Jesus and the law, talking about the relationship between Jesus and the Torah and Jewish law and Judaism, trying to make the case that from a Jewish perspective, that Jesus was born Jewish and lived a Jewish life and died Jewish, but even more, that he had some very important and interesting things to say from within Judaism, that Jesus was not the one who started Christianity, and that it didn't occur to him to start a new religion, but a lot of things did occur to him, and he was a very fascinating figure, a human being from a Jewish perspective, not the Messiah, not the Son of God, fascinating figure who had some interesting things to say and some thoughts to express, and lived by an incredibly high standard. What we saw last time was that in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, one of the most important speeches in the Christian scriptures, he takes the Ten Commandments. It's called the Sermon on the Mount because this is a kind of parallel to the making of the covenant with Moses and the Jewish people as God did on Mount Sinai. And so now in a hill in Judea, Jesus speaks and reinterprets the Ten Commandments, but in fascinating ways, saying, of course you shouldn't murder, but I'm going to define murder as insulting your neighbor, calling him a name. And if you do that, you commit murder. He interprets adultery as that if you have lust in your heart for somebody else, and who is married, or if you're married, then that is already adultery. He talks about not doing violence and not swearing falsely against anyone, and not swearing at all. So he is living by very high standards and demands of us that we live by a very high standard. One of the things I talked about in the last session, in the first part of these two sessions, is to place him in his time and place, to place him among the movements at the time, and also to place him in our terms, in terms of the modern movements of Judaism. In terms of modern Judaism, would we call him Orthodox? Would we call him conservative? Would we call him Reform? Would we call him Reconstructionist? In terms of his day, would we call him a Sadducee? Would we call him a Pharisee? Would we call him an Essene? Would we call him an Apocalypticist? And what we're seeing is that, like the Pharisees, he interprets. Unlike the Sadducees, he is talking a lot about the kingdom of heaven, about how to get to salvation, about how to get to heaven, as opposed to the Sadducees, who are all about this world and who do not seem to believe in the world to come. So in that, he was like the Pharisees, who talked a lot about heaven. Like an Essene, he seems to have been celibate. We don't see him with anybody else, despite what some modern cultural efforts have tried to say. We don't see him with somebody else sexually, so that that might make him seem like an Essene, because the Essenes were celibate. Unlike the Apocalypticists, he does not sanction violence of any kind, and the Apocalypticists were people who wanted to rebel against Rome. Eventually, they did, but it was many years after Jesus died. Unlike the Apocalypticists, he absolutely forbids violence and hates violence of any kind. He seems very pacifistic, as a matter of fact. And yet, there is somebody with him, one of his best friends, named Judas Iscariot. And Iscariot is Sicarii. He was a dagger man. He was an assassin. He was one of the most violent. He's called a member of the group of the most violent rebels. And I said last time that when the Romans came to arrest him, he says, "Put away your swords," which means, as opposed to what I would have thought, that all of Jesus' disciples were nonviolent, and none of them would have been carrying swords. He says, "Put away your swords." Does that mean that some of his followers were apocalypticists, were zealots, were Sicarii? And maybe, interestingly enough, it's just a guess, that he attracted members of all the different groups, or maybe forward-thinking members of all these different groups. That would be an interesting way to put together his 12 disciples. Remember that the number 12 is not a coincidence. It's not an accident. There were 12 tribes of Israel. So to say that there were, sorry, I don't know how that happened. That's me and my grandson, and I don't know how that happened. Here we go. Thank you. Hi, Avi. So maybe, and again, it's just sort of an interesting guess that I haven't heard, at least recently, by anybody, that he was bringing different people from different groups, and they sort of formed a united Israel, or a sort of a new vision of what Israel and the Jewish people could be. Anyway, today I'm going to pick up where I left off. I was talking about how, how we can find Jesus. And so we can get hints from Jesus's religion, that is, Jesus's version of Judaism and his relationship to Judaism, by seeing what the people around him did. And after he died, the book that concerns what happened after he died is the book of Acts, a very interesting book. We see that after Jesus died, or according to Christian scripture, was resurrected, that there's the sense that any day now, Jesus is going to come back. And what was supposed to be in the meantime, two people take over the leadership of the group that he had led. One is his brother James, another is his best friend Peter. You'll remember that Peter denied knowing Jesus 3 times, but that's because he was scared. We can certainly understand that kind of fear. And so when we see James and we see Peter and we see how they're acting, they are living Jewish lives. Now, when we're talking about the law, when we're talking about Jesus' relationship to the law in Judaism, what are we talking about? To go over it, it means, do they keep the dietary laws, the laws of kashrut, keeping kosher? Did they go to the temple in Jerusalem? Did they follow the Sabbath? Was their Sabbath celebrated and observed on the 7th day, on what we would call Friday night and Saturday? Because if they did, if James and Peter kept kosher, if they kept the Sabbath, then we can guess that as followers of Jesus, they were imitating what he did, that they were observing Judaism like he did. And so that meant that he kept kosher and that he kept the Sabbath on Saturday. And we know that he went to the temple. So the scene I'm bringing you to is in Acts chapter 10. I have it on the screen here. And it is Acts chapter 10, verse 9. And this is about Peter. The next day, as they were on their journey and coming near the city, Peter went up on the housetop to pray about the 6th hour. You were supposed to daven. You're supposed to pray 3 times a day. I do this in my daily worship, in my daily prayer. I pray 3 times a day. And one service is in the afternoon, one service is in the evening, and one service is in the morning. So Peter's going to say one of our 3 daily services in the 6th hour. And he became hungry and desired something to eat. But while they were preparing it, he fell into a trance and saw the heaven opened and something descending like a great sheet, let down by 4 corners upon the earth. In it were all kinds of animals and reptiles and birds of the air. And there came a voice to him, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "No, Lord, for I've never eaten anything that is common or unclean." So what's going on? What are the laws of kashrut? Very quickly, you're supposed to separate milk and meat. You're not supposed to eat milk and meat together. Why not? Milk is life. Meat is literally a dead animal. We don't mix life and death. You're not supposed to kill an animal that has not been killed in a kosher way, which means it's killed without pain. So you cannot eat roadkill. You can only kill something that has been killed in a ritually prescribed way. And you're not supposed to eat certain unclean animals like a pig. Or any pig products. So those are some basic laws of kashrut in 3 seconds. So when Peter sees this vision And remember that he's really hungry, and whoever's cooking for him is a little bit on the slow side. They haven't brought him his meal yet. And all of a sudden, there's a great sheet, and all these animals and reptiles and birds of the air come down. And so he's told to kill and eat. But he says, I can't do that. I've never eaten a reptile before. I can't eat any animal that's not considered kosher, means appropriate for eating. It's not kosher. He says, I've never eaten anything that's common or unclean, which means that all the time he was with Jesus, he had kept kosher, which means that Jesus kept kosher. And it's never occurred to him. So even though there's a voice from heaven telling him, yes, you can eat in a non-kosher way, you can kill something just like that in a non-ritually prescribed way, and Peter says, I can't do it. And the voice comes to him a second time and says, what God has cleansed, you must not call common. In other words, forget these usual laws about keeping kosher. You can eat it. This happened 3 times, and the thing was taken up at once to heaven. So Peter doesn't know what to do with this. Now, while Peter was inwardly perplexed as to what the vision which he had seen might mean, now think about that. It's quite clear what it means. It means that God has told him, you don't have to keep kosher. I mean, this is a sign from heaven. We always talk about, give me a sign from heaven. Here it is. And what's going on, the reason why this is happening at this moment is early Christianity, or early Jewish Christianity, as we might call it, because these people were still Jewish. The word Christianity was not being used yet. So this, we'll call them Jews for Jesus, or Jewish Christians, or Christian Jews, or Jews who believed that Jesus was the Messiah. This early group is trying to figure out its identity, but so far it's a Jewish group. It's a movement of Judaism. They're Jewish, but there's with one difference from everybody else. They believed that the Messiah had come. Now, why didn't the rest of the Jewish people believe that the Messiah had come? Because, as I was talking about last time, when the Messiah comes, there will be peace on earth. There will be no more wars. There'll be no more oppression. There'll be no more slavery. There'll be pure equality. And so all the other Jewish people were saying, well, Jesus couldn't have been the Messiah because nothing's changed. We wish that he had been the Messiah. If he had been the Messiah, my uncle wouldn't have died last week. I wouldn't have just gotten the flu. Please, we wish he would have been the Messiah, but he couldn't have been because, in a sense, the proof is in the pudding. Things haven't changed. The Romans are still here. There are still wars. People are getting crucified every day. And so this Jewish movement was led by Jesus' brother James and his best friend Peter, are doing Judaism, observing Judaism as they always had, and which was the only way they knew. So it might be clear to me what that vision means. The vision, might mean that you're allowed to change things, but Peter is perplexed by the whole idea of it, because it's so foreign to him. The whole idea that he might be able to eat something that is non-kosher is just an alien idea to him. Another issue that was another issue between different groups trying to figure out what this new movement was going to be was circumcision. Jewish boys have always been circumcised at the age of 8 days old, and so. But when there was a movement to say, "Gee, maybe we should not demand circumcision of our people," there were factions, and you can see here in chapter 11 there was what they called the circumcision party and the uncircumcision party. That is, there were factions saying, you don't, in order to have Jesus in your life, do you have to be circumcised or not? And so these issues of what you can eat, do you have to be circumcised, were defining what this movement would be. And so here in chapter 11, he's going to talk about the experience that I just had read to you. Chapter 11, verse 4. But Peter began and explained to them in order. I was in the city of Joppa praying, and in a trance I saw a vision, something descending like a great sheet, let down from heaven by four corners, and it came down to me. Looking at it closely, I observed animals and beasts of prey and reptiles and birds of the air. And I heard a voice saying to me, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." But I said, "No, Lord, for nothing common or unclean has ever entered my mouth." But the voice answered a second time from heaven, "What God has cleansed, you must not call common." In other words, anything that God has created is kosher, is fit for eating. This happened three times, and all was drawn up again into heaven. And so, here we have, in a sort of an unusual way, a repetition of the same scene. So he's going over what had happened, and he's talking about, what does this mean? What should this mean? So the point I'm trying to make in this section is simply that we can tell about Jesus' Judaism from what his best friend Peter was doing. The whole idea of not keeping kosher is foreign to him. Here in another passage, verse 14. And he called the people to him again and said to him, "Hear me, all of you, and understand. There's nothing outside a man which by going into him can defile him. But the things which come out of a man are what defiled him." This is against the very idea of keeping kosher. And when he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about the parable. And he said to them, "Then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a man from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart but his stomach and so passes on? Thus he declared all foods clean." And so he's saying, you know what? We're going to talk about morality. This stuff about what you are, what you eat, forget about this. We don't have to do these laws anymore. So we feel this movement of Judaism moving away from Jewish law, from a key component of Jewish law. And so he's saying, don't worry about that stuff. All you should worry about is what comes out of your mouth. That is how you talk to other people. The evil that you can do with your mouth, not what goes in, only think about what goes out, which is an interesting and clever way to think. I'm going to move on from the idea of keeping kosher to the Sabbath. And the passage I have here is from Mark. And let's just talk about the Sabbath rules for a minute. On the Sabbath, you're not allowed to work. And so I keep the Sabbath. And that means that if I need food for the Sabbath, which of course I do, I have to buy that or cook that or make that on Friday afternoon, or the day before Friday night. That is the day leading into Friday night, the day before the Sabbath. You're not supposed to do any work. Why not? It goes back to Genesis chapter 1. God created the world, and on the seventh day, on the Sabbath, he rested. So we are supposed to rest. So you're not supposed to work. And clearly, Jesus is an observant Jewish person, and his disciples did not, never worked on the Sabbath. But here comes the passage, verse 23. Mark chapter 3, verse 23. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" So the Pharisees, again, this will distinguish this movement from the Pharisees. The Pharisees saying, "You can't work on the Sabbath." And now, what were they doing? They were hungry. Probably not the worst thing in the world. On the other hand, you're not supposed to do it. Just to be very plain and open about this, if I was walking through a field and I was hungry on the Sabbath and I picked up those grains, I would consider myself to be at fault. I would consider myself to have broken the Sabbath. That's working on the Sabbath. That's not something I would do. If somebody else did it, it would be, it wouldn't matter to me one way or another. That's their business. But the Pharisees are going to take him on. All of these things are symbolic. All of these things are big actions because they represent the way Jesus thought. And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry? Lie in those," I don't know what's wrong there. It was hungry. He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest. and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. I think what he's saying, we'll go back to the kosher example. He said he's changing things, or at least his disciples are changing things, and they're developing a way. But here it's Jesus himself to say, and I have it underlined here, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. That is, we are not subservient to the laws of the Sabbath. We control the laws of the Sabbath. And I think he's saying there, so human beings, that is, we are all, the Son of Man simply means humans. We are lords even of the Sabbath. Well, that's a different way to think. I have a little note at the top of the page. Jesus feels the need to justify what he's doing. Why does he feel that need? He feels the need because they have broken the laws of the Sabbath. It doesn't matter that the example is a small one, plucking some grain from a field. It's what we can learn from it. So if we're trying to place Jesus, Jesus seems to have kept kosher, but then later disciples would break away from keeping kosher. But it stands to reason to say that means Jesus always had kept kosher. Here, however, we have a different kind of example. And here he seems more like a Reformed Jewish person who would say, no, I'm going to tell you I'm going to define what the Sabbath is. And so we have different kinds of examples. And again, that's sort of my point. My point is that if you look at Jesus' life or try to figure out how he observed things, it really feels like he's thinking for himself on every kind of issue. And so staying on this example, this category, this topic of the Sabbath, here is a passage from Luke. Luke chapter 13, verse 10. Now, he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And now, just think about that. Jesus was teaching in the synagogue on the Sabbath. That means he was probably preaching about the Torah portion for the day. That, again, shows Jesus' Jewishness. He was an observant Jewish person who was in the synagogue on the Sabbath. And there was a woman who had a spirit of infirmity for 18 years. She was bent over and could not fully straighten herself. And when Jesus saw her, he called her and said to her, "Woman, you are freed from your infirmity." So he laid his hands upon her, and immediately she was made straight, and she praised God. But the ruler of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, said to the people, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day." Then the Lord answered him, "You hypocrites," and it goes on. So the question is, can you heal on the Sabbath? Well, I know a lot of Jewish doctors, and if they're called upon or if there's an emergency or something, they will certainly heal on the Sabbath. But again, we see differentiation. We see people condemning him for doing that. I have to tell you, if there was a woman who had not been able to straighten herself out for 18 years and somebody healed her in my synagogue, I would be very grateful to everybody concerned. But you see him arguing with them. Certainly, I would not find any fault with that. But in terms of the mores, the laws of the time, you see him differentiating himself. And there are other examples. And so here, we're going to have another example of the same exact thing. Chapter 14, verse 3. And Jesus spoke to the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they were silent. In other words, they were pretty mixed up with that. What do you do? I mean, after all, there's nothing higher than healing. There's nothing in Judaism higher than saving a life. But they were silent. They took him and healed him and let him go. And so you see, people are quite impressed, but don't quite know what to do with him because he's charting different directions. My point is pretty simple. We have in the life. Sorry, I can't seem to get rid of that. Sorry. Um, uh, we we have in these stories about Jesus a picture about Jesus as a Jewish man who was born Jewish, lived a Jewish life, um, was finding some new directions within Judaism, was thinking for himself on every issue. He differentiated himself from, I think, all the other different groups, and maybe gave his own group an identity in the process. It was a Jewish group, and in the next session we'll talk about how it developed into another religion, not just a movement of Judaism, but another religion.